But getting back to moving along chronologically to the 20th century, we started improving the breeds. We had two major disease epidemics, plagues, if you will. The first one that started in the 1920s was the fever tick, the Texas fever tick, and that required the cattle to be dipped in an arsenic solution every 2 weeks. That was a lot of work. But we were successful in eradicating the Texas fever tick in fairly short order. There were quarantines from different points of different counties. So I have some visuals of that. But the longer disease problem, that there's still people around that remember it because it wasn't solved until 1959. It started in the 20s, but I think really got going in the 30s, and that was the screwworms, which came from a fly. And the screwworm fly would lay its eggs on any open wound or sore, anywhere there was blood, whether it be just on the ear. Of course, when calves are born, on their navel, that was the most commonplace. And so what they had to do was get every individual animal periodically and inspect it and treat it with, there was a couple of 3 different brands. Barry's screwworm killer was made in Newberry. Smearex was probably more popular. I'm not sure where that was made, but these were these sort of nasty ointments that involved pine tar and I think benzodrine, and they treated those. This went on for 25 or 30 years. And I've talked to some of the old timers that's all they did for 30 years was treat screwworms. It was not enjoyable. It was a lot of work, and it had, of course, extremely serious impact on the Florida cattle ranching industry. And it was eventually solved, I guess, by the USDA. They sterilized male screwworm flies, and they airdropped, and when we get the presentation back, you'll see those slides. They airdropped these flies and larvae over the state, and it was in a matter of months the problem was solved. And that was not until, if I'm correct, 1959. I grew up down near Homestead, and I remember screwworms, when I graduated high school in '62, when I was in junior high. In fact, my brother-in-law's family had a hog that was infected with screwworms. So they didn't just infect cattle, it was also hogs and wildlife, anything. So that was a real big deal, and Florida was one of the first states to solve the problem. Another thing later was brucellosis, which there's also a term for it. It causes cows to, you got it? Mm-hmm. Cows to abort, pregnant cows to abort, and that's fairly recent, and we were fairly recently maybe 10 years ago, declared brucellosis free. But like I know one fellow that was his job for years, was a brucellosis inspector. They do blood tests. They still do it. And they tattoo the ears of the animal to show that they've been tested. Well, here we are. We're back.
All right.
I was so sure that I was able to. The remote's not working. Is it not on? Oh, there it's going. Yeah.
Okay.
Zing, 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 zing. Probably quicker to do it this way. Whoops. So here's a profile of a Brahman bull from, I think this is from about the 1920s. There were certain families associated with introducing the Brahman cattle, and one of them that was quite important was the Partin family, P-A-R-T-I-N, down in Kissimmee. And that family's still around. Some of them did sell out and move to Texas when the whole Orlando-Kissimmee area was developed. You can identify Brahman cattle. These are not mixed breed. These are pure Brahman cattle. Identify them by those ears that hang down and by the horn set. And of course, the hump on the back. I was talking about the fever ticks. Here's a cow on the left that's been a victim of fever ticks, and a cow on the right that's not. This is from an old, I believe it was a USDA poster or graphic. There they are dipping for ticks in the arsenic solution. You can still find remnants of these old tick vats on a lot of ranches. This is a poster about eradicating screwworms. This is Barry's screwworm killer, which was made in Newberry by a pharmacist. Here's the fellow on the plane with the load. You can see in the cardboard boxes there. These are the sterilized screwworm flies in there that he's going to airdrop. It was very successful. Part of our thing of being one of maybe the last frontier in cattle ranching was fencing. Now, we were doing fencing. There was, of course, controversy over fencing, but early on, before it was required, ranchers were doing fencing largely to protect their breeds that they were trying to, quote, improve from breeding with stray cattle, so wild cattle. So there was some fencing, but it wasn't until 1949 that it became mandatory. And you can see the consequences. For example, this is in Volusia County. Car hits a cow and flips the car and probably killed the cow too. I've actually I was in another one of my areas of specialization, interviewed a gospel musician, black gospel musician, that in the late 40s ran into a cow outside of Ocala. He was pulling a large house trailer and the brakes weren't good and there wasn't anything he could do. He couldn't stop in time. Cow was out in the middle of the road. The Florida cattle ranching for a long time and goes way back, and we continue to have a strong and close relationship with citrus. In fact, many, many cattle ranchers are also involved in citrus. One of the keys to success, or at least avoiding disaster, is to diversify in agriculture. And so, hopefully if you have cattle and citrus, if you have a bad cattle year, maybe you'll have a good citrus year and things might balance out. Did you hear the one about the farmer that won the lottery? He won, $50 million or something. And they asked him what he was going to do with all that money. He says, I'll keep farming until it's all gone, But you don't see, there are still some people who feed their cattle whole citrus. And this is a real Florida graphic here. You can see that's a Brahman cow with a whole grapefruit. But more commonly, what you see is citrus byproducts used in the feed. That's used a whole lot in feed today. This is our little sort of diversity section. We just want to give you an example of who these people are. There's a cattle rancher sitting in our audience here, Mr. Alan Roberts. But this is one of the legendary, highly regarded cattlemen in Florida, Mr. Bud Adams. Among other things, he established the breed that's known as Brayford, which is a hybrid of Hereford and Brahman. They're red cattle. He started the Foundation herd, and he's down in Fort Pierce. His ranch is a showplace. He does do tours. I know the Humanities Council had an event there a few years ago. If you ever get a chance, it's a beautiful place. He's a natural-born ecologist. Bud's getting up in years. He's, I think, probably at least 85 now. And so his sons are keeping the business going. He's right outside of Fort Pierce, his main ranch. They have a couple other locations. I mentioned the Parton family that was instrumental in introducing Brahman cattle. This is the Parton family, probably 3 generations in this picture. We've had African Americans, not so much as cattle owners and ranchers, but as workers. But Lawrence Silas is our most well-known, most renowned African American historic cattleman. He was down in, I guess, Orange County, in Osceola County too, down near Orlando, and had quite a few cattle and was very highly regarded. This is a contemporary African-American cattleman, Lewis Clayton, up in Alachua County. Has cattle on leased land on Kanapaha Prairie, which is a natural prairie. And like many cattlemen in north central Florida, he doesn't do any more farming, but he was farming, I think, peanuts is popular up there, and he also raised hogs too. So you probably find more of that in north central Florida. The more intensive cattle ranching, where people are only cattle ranchers, would be, say, around Okeechobee, Kissimmee area. As you know, we have a lot of Cuban Americans and other Hispanic cultural groups, ethnic groups in South Florida especially. In Cuba, for example, there weren't many ranchers. You know, there were a few, but there were a lot of people that had a few cows. So you might not have been able to classify them as cattle ranchers, but they were cowboys or vaqueros, and it became an important part of their culture. So while you won't find any cattle ranches in Dade County, you do find people with a few cows on property, maybe for tax purposes. And there's a couple of roping clubs. This is a photo I took in Medley, which is near Hialeah, a little industrial town, and where they have a weekly roping. You can't see it probably in this photo, but this, actually, can we get the lights back down? Anybody know how to operate? Grant ran off. Yeah, yeah, great. Even the other side too. This makes the photos look better. Anyhow, he has a cigar in his mouth. So I had to use that shot. This is another Cuban American. He was a rodeo champion in Cuba, and now works as a horse trainer and riding instructor outside of Homestead. We had him up at the Florida Folk Festival. He's a good roper. He was, I think he entered in what they call all-around cowboy in rodeo, which means you have to compete in 5 different events. Of course, women are extremely important in ranching culture and business. They do everything the men do, except some of them might not do the very most strenuous work, but they do everything. Renee Strickland is a cattle owner and rancher with her husband, but Renee heads up their exporting business, and she sells cattle all over the world. They export cattle. You name it, they've shipped cattle there, all over Europe, the former communist bloc, you name it. They're down in Manatee County. Ranch life, of course, revolves around the annual cycle of the calves. You know, cows, by the way, have a 9-month gestation period, just like we do. And they call the calves that they ship out yearlings, but they're not quite a year old. I think it's usually more like 9 or 10 months old, but they're known as yearlings. And 2 or maybe 3 times a year they have to do what they call work the cattle. These 2 guys here are administering oral medicine for worms. She's giving a vaccination, and he's spraying along the back for external parasites, largely flies. And they can also, this is called a squeeze chute, and they run the cattle into these pens and have a series of gates that direct them into these squeeze chutes, and the thing clamps, it's electro-hydraulic, it clamps down on the animal and holds them while they can do all these operations at once. They'll also do branding. Those sides come down so they can poke a hot branding iron in there, ear tags or ear marking. And this is kind of typical, you know, the young lady is a granddaughter. This is Iris Wall's place down in Indiantown. And this is one of her son-in-laws. And these 2 guys here are hired hands.